Good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's UDRC research webinar on our education and workforce pipeline for STEM students in Utah. So I am Ari Fenn. I'm the Assistant Commissioner of Research here at USHE, and I'm going to be hosting this webinar along with Karen Tao, who is a Senior Research Scientist here at UDRC, who is the researcher responsible for this research. So before we get started on presenting the actual research, I have a few administrative details that I want to cover. First, this webinar is being recorded, and it will be posted online at UDRC's website, udrc.ushe.edu, and will be available for future reference for anyone interested. So we're going to go ahead and spend the first 45 minutes talking about the report, and then we'll have time for questions at the end. So about 10 to 15 minutes, just depending on how long we run. So if you have any questions, please feel free to use the Q&A function to post those questions, and we will address those again at the end of the seminar. So this webinar is going to be a conversational format. I'm going to be asking some of my own questions to Karen throughout the session, and then we'll again reserve taking audience questions until the end. So also we do have the chat function open because we want to hear from you and get to know everyone who's on this webinar. So please feel free to introduce yourself in the chat. You can put your name, job title, and your organization. You're also welcome to share anything else pertinent to this research and this topic. So if you have any relevant resources or links, your own research that you want to highlight as well that's related to this, please feel free to drop links to that in the chat. Amy and Jessica, welcome. Thanks for getting us started with introducing yourselves. Everyone else, feel free to join in. So quickly about the Utah Data Research Center. So the UDRC is the state's longitudinal data system. We connect the state data on K-12, post-secondary education, employment, and health. Our mission is to conduct meaningful research to inform public policy initiatives, providing the platform for policymakers, practitioners, and the public to make data-informed decisions. All of our previous research is available at udrc.ushe.edu, as well as data narratives from previous research, previous webinars, and you could request your own data for your own research from us as well. So I would like to take a brief second to introduce Karen. Karen is a senior research scientist here at the UDRC. Previous roles was a senior business analyst at the Department of Workforce Services UI division, and then as well as an associate at Goldman Sachs. Karen holds a master's degree in data science from the University of Helsinki. Some of her other UDRC projects include STEM students and gender wage gap. So I'm going to go ahead and pass this to Karen, who will share a little bit more about herself.
Thank you, Ari. So yeah, I've been with the UDRC since 2019, and I've enjoyed working on the various projects for the UDRC. And this current one, the workforce and education outcome for STEM students, really grew out of a question that I think a lot of people in education and workforce policy are wrestling with. We know STEM fields are critical for Utah's economy and for individual opportunity, but who is actually making it through the STEM pipeline and where are the gaps? So at the UDRC, we had a unique opportunity to link together higher education records with workforce data in Utah. And that let us trace students from the moment they declared a STEM major all the way through to their wages several years later. And I was excited to see what the data would tell us.
Great. Thanks, Karen. So let's go ahead and set the stage. Can you tell us a bit about the scope of the study and why STEM was the focus?
Sure. So STEM education sits at the intersection of two things we care deeply about in Utah: workforce development and economic competitiveness. So the challenge is that participation and outcomes in STEM remain really uneven across demographic groups. So we wanted to look at this specifically through a leaky pipeline lens. So that means we weren't just asking how many students graduate with STEM degrees. We were asking where along the journey students exit those pathways and why. And we put particular emphasis on mathematics, especially calculus, because the research and our data both point to calculus as a gateway course, one that has an outsized influence on whether a student stays in STEM or not.
So I can't wait to hear more about this leaky pipeline approach. But before we jump into that, do you mind walking us through the research questions?
Sure thing. So we organized the study around 5 core questions. First, who is declaring STEM majors? And what does the demographic picture look like? And how has it changed over time? Second, how do graduation rates compare between STEM students and their non-STEM peers, broken down by demographic group? And third, what factors actually predict whether a student who starts in STEM ends up completing a STEM degree? Fourth, where in the pipeline are students most likely to exit STEM? And finally, fifth, what are the workforce outcomes? So that means their employment rates, wages, for students with different combinations of initial STEM declaration and their final degree types. So together, those 5 questions give us a full picture of the pipeline from the first enrollment to workforce entry.
Can you help us understand the data that you use to address these questions?
Sure. We had 2 main data sources linked together. So from the Utah System of Higher Education, USHE, we have enrollment and graduation records, including the field of study a student declared, whether and when they graduated, the degree level, and importantly, mathematics course records, including grades and whether students withdrew. Now, on the workforce side, we have quarterly wage data from the Department of Workforce Services, DWS, including the industry sector where students earned most of their wages. So linking these 2 sources is what makes this kind of pipeline analysis possible. We can follow the same students from their first USHE enrollment through their early career wages.
And how large is this study? How many students were you able to include?
Well, it is a substantial data set. So we analyzed 249,934 degree-seeking students who enrolled in USHE for the first time after high school. And that's cohorts from 2012 to 2020. Now, of those, 17%, and that's about 42,000 students, declared a STEM major when they first enrolled. And among all of the USHE graduates in this sample, about 15.3% earned at least one STEM credential. And for our detailed workforce analysis, we focused on the 2012 to 2014 cohorts, so roughly 85,000 students there. And that's because they had enough years of post-education wage data to analyze long-term outcomes.
Can you share with us a snapshot of the main findings before we go into the details?
Yes, so at a high level, 4 things stood out. STEM participation among underrepresented groups is growing, but gaps persist. Mathematics, and especially calculus, is the strongest academic predictor of STEM completion. The first year after declaring STEM is by far the most vulnerable point in the STEM pipeline, and STEM graduates have clear and growing wage advantages over their peers.
Thank you. Before we jump into some of these other ones, you mind painting us a demographic picture of our STEM students?
Sure. So the graph on this slide tells us the overall story on race and ethnicity. So as you can see here, white students continue to make up the majority of STEM enrollees, mirroring their share of the overall USHE population. But the representation in STEM actually declined from 82% in 2012 to 76% in 2020. Hispanic students, on the other hand, show the most notable growth, increasing from 9.5% to 13% of STEM enrollees over that same period. And students from other racial and ethnic groups, so those are Asian, Black, Native American, multiracial, and Pacific Islander students, they collectively grew their share from 8.4% to 11% of STEM students. So the direction is encouraging, but these groups are still representing a relatively small fraction of total STEM enrollments. And the gaps remain large.
You know what accounts for the growth among Hispanic students specifically?
So the data doesn't let us pinpoint a single cause, but is consistent with the overall enrollment growth among Hispanic students in USU over this period. Now, what's encouraging is that the increase is showing up at the declaration stage. Students are entering USU and choosing STEM from the start. Now, what we need to track is whether that initial declaration translates to persistence and completion at similar rates, which is where the pipeline findings become important.
So progress is real, but there's still a long way to go by the sounds of it. What about the gender makeup of our STEM students?
Well, gender is a really interesting and somewhat mixed story. On the enrollment side, the proportion of women declaring STEM majors increased from 25.3% in 2012 to 32.5% by 2020. Now, that's a meaningful jump. Roughly one in four STEM students were women at the start of the study period. And by the end, it was closer to one in three. And that signals improvement in access and in the willingness of women to pursue STEM pathways.
But I'm sensing there's more to that picture.
Yeah, you're right. So women make up about half of all USU enrollment, actually slightly more than half by 2020. So even at 32.5% of STEM students, they're substantially underrepresented compared to their share of the overall student population. And when we look at graduation, the proportion of women among STEM graduates grew only modestly from 27% to 31% between 2012 and 2019. Men continue to earn most STEM degrees, and we'll see later in the modeling results that women actually have significantly lower odds of completing a STEM degree even after controlling for other factors.
Oh, and STEM students are taking a lot more math overall. Is that correct?
That is correct. So on average, STEM students attempted 5.3 mathematics courses and covered 2.1 unique topics, compared to 3.5 courses and 1.7 topics for non-STEM students. Now, that heavier math course load is part of why STEM degrees take longer. STEM students took longer to complete their degrees, and that time difference reflect the structured, sequential nature of STEM math requirements.
So, understanding the difference in course loads, can we talk a bit more about the time to completion difference across credential types?
Sure. So the gap is most striking at the short certificate level. Now, if you look at certificates requiring less than 1 year, STEM students averaged 45.7 months to complete compared to 33.1 months for non-STEM students. And that's a 12-month difference for a credential that's nominally under a year. Part of that is likely the prerequisite structure. If you need specific math or science foundations before you can even begin the technical coursework for a short-term STEM credential, you're adding time that doesn't show up in the program's nominal length. And at the bachelor's level, the gap closes considerably. So 60.1 months for STEM degrees versus 58.1 for non-STEM degrees, reflecting how much of the sequential math requirement is already baked into the program structure.
So, let's talk about that leaky pipeline itself. How much leakage is happening and where?
So the scale of the leaky pipeline is one of the most significant findings in the study. Of all students who initially declared a STEM major, 91.6% ultimately left a STEM pathway before completing a STEM degree. And that's nearly 19 out of 20 STEM declaring students not completing a STEM degree. And the timing of that departure is concentrated in a very small, narrow window. 79.5% of STEM departing students left within the first year. And that early exit accounts for 86.8% of all the pipeline leakage we measured.
So that first year is crucial when it comes to STEM attrition.
Exactly. And there is a silver lining in that. Students who make it past the first year are increasingly likely to persist. Among STEM declaring students who graduated from USHI at all, 55.3% earned at least one STEM credential. Now compare that to just 7.4% of students who started in a non-STEM field graduating with a STEM degree. So declaration really matters, and persistence past year one also really matters.
So can you tell us about this diagram that we're seeing, the pathway diagram?
Yeah, so in this diagram here, the Sankey diagram traces where STEM declaring students end up. The flow shows students moving from their initial STEM declaration into different outcomes. So some persist and graduate with a STEM degree. Some switched to a non-STEM major and graduate from that. Now, some are still showing up with USU enrollments, so they're still studying. Some enter the workforce, and then there are still some students who are not in the workforce or the USU data. The most visually striking feature of this diagram here is how large the early exit flow is, and that's the bottom highlighted blue pathway. You can see the width of that pathway shrinking dramatically in that first year, and it reinforces the pipeline finding. If we want to improve STEM completion rates, the first year experience is the highest leverage intervention point.
So before we get into the workforce findings, can you explain how we measured and defined wages in the workforce?
Absolutely. So a couple of important parameters to look at here. We're using quarterly wage data from DWS through the fourth quarter of 2021. And for each student, wage outcomes are measured starting from their last post-secondary enrollment or graduation. So we're looking at wages from the point they left USHI, not before. And we also distinguish between all workers with any wage records and what we call strongly attached workers. And the definition for a strongly attached worker is that they earn at least 3,770 in each quarter of the year for all four quarters. So that is the equivalent of working 40 hours a week at the federal minimum wage for all four quarters. So that definition lets us separate people with consistent full-time year-round labor market engagement from those with partial year or part-time records, which is important for making fair comparisons across the groups. And finally, quarterly wages were adjusted to 2024 dollars using the CPIU.
So thanks for walking us through the adjustments that you make for wages and how we define some of those workforce outcomes. What does the wage data show us?
So among students with wage records, and that's about 79.9% of the cohort, STEM graduates consistently earned the highest wages of any group we examined. In year one, right after leaving higher education, their median annual wage for STEM graduates were $45,145 compared to $33,912 for non-STEM graduates. And that's already an 11,000 gap in the first year alone.
Wow, uh, that is quite the gap. Can you tell us, does that gap grow or does it shrink over time?
So this gap grows. By year four, STEM graduates were earning $54,102 compared to $39,154 for non-STEM graduates. The gap has widened to about 15,000. And here is the finding that I think we should look at. Even among students who did not graduate at all, former STEM students earned about $6,238 more per year than non-STEM non-graduates. So the initial commitment to a STEM pathway carries a wage signal, even for those who don't complete a degree. Early STEM engagement appears to build skills or signal values in the labor market, even without the credential itself. So that's meaningful because it suggests the pipeline is not all or nothing. Even partial engagement with STEM has economic values.
So, what about when you look specifically at those who are strongly attached workers, the consistent wage earners?
Yeah, the premiums get substantially larger here. Among strongly attached workers in year one, STEM graduates earn $68,014. Compare that to $50,847 for STEM declaring students who ended up graduating in a non-STEM field. So those are students who started in STEM, did not complete a STEM degree, but finished with a non-STEM degree. And that's already $17,000 gap in year one just from the field of degree. And by year five, that gap grows to $22,666.
So, $22,600 is pretty striking. And that's basically what, 1 year's worth of full-time's earning for some people.
Yeah, it really is. And the modeling reinforces why this matters. In regression models we'll talk about later, we see prediction of year one wages among strongly attached workers. So graduation status and initial STEM declaration were the two strongest positive predictors. And that tells us both things matter, whether you graduate at all and whether you had initial commitment to a STEM pathway. So early engagement isn't just about identity or belonging. It has measurable long-term economic consequences.
So, you just mentioned in that last little discussion about statistical modeling. Can you briefly walk us through the approaches so our audience understands how to interpret the model findings over the next few slides?
Sure thing. So we used three types of models depending on the outcome. For binary outcomes, those are the yes/no questions like whether someone graduated, whether they got a STEM degree, whether they were employed. We used logistic regression, and that gives us odds ratios. Now, for continuous outcomes like annual wages and time to degree, we used linear regression. And for over-dispersed count data, specifically the number of quarters before a student appeared in wage records, we used a negative binomial model. And all models used a stepwise selection process, dropping variables that weren't statistically significant. And the reference category throughout the research is a non-STEM declaring white man.
So, what does the modeling tell us about who completes a STEM degree?
So, four findings stand out from the graduation models. First, initial STEM declaration is the most predictive. Students who declared a STEM major when they first enrolled was 6.2 times more likely to complete a STEM degree than students who didn't. And that is the single strongest predictor in the entire model, stronger than race, gender, or any course variables. So early commitment matters.
And what about calculus? Does that show up here too?
Yes, it does. So for every 1 unit increase in the overall calculus credit completion rate, the odds of graduating from USHI at all, and that includes STEM degrees and non-STEM degrees, increase by 374%. So success in calculus is not just about STEM completion. It predicts general graduation. Now, the gender findings. Women had 44% higher odds of graduating from USHE than men overall. But as I touched on earlier when we were talking about descriptive statistics, women have 68% lower odds of specifically completing a STEM degree. So women are graduating more, but they're graduating in other fields. Understanding what is happening in that gap, why women who arrive at USHE are less likely to stay in STEM even as they persist to graduation, is one of the most important open questions that require further research.
So you mentioned calculus as a gateway course. Tell us what you found with modeling. I think this might be one of the most striking parts of your study overall.
I agree, it really is. So when we modeled the factors that predict whether a student completes a STEM degree, calculus rose to the top in a dramatic way. A higher credit completion rate in calculus, meaning successfully completing a higher proportion of the calculus credits that you attempt, increased the odds of STEM graduation by 287%. Attempting more calculus courses at all raises those odds by 130%, and these are large effects.
What about the reverse? What happens when students struggle with those calculus courses?
So the reverse is equally striking. A higher withdrawal rate from mathematics courses is associated with 63% lower odds of completing a STEM degree. Taking calculus for the first time in the first year in USHE, rather than having a stronger foundation coming in, is associated with 24% lower odds of STEM graduation. And taking it after that, so after the first year, is associated with 31% lower odds. So timing really matters here. Students who arrive at USHE without calculus already in their background are starting behind. And the data shows that that gap has real consequences for completion.
Okay, so what about the workforce side? What did the models find there?
So again, four numbers worth highlighting here. A USHE graduate earns on average $13,900 more per year than a non-graduate in the first year after leaving higher ed. So holding all other factors constant. And that's the graduation premium. Now, for wage records and initial stamp declaration among strongly attached workers, that premium is 6,371 on top of that. So the combination of graduating and having started in STEM is substantial. USHE graduates also had 70% higher odds of being strongly attached to the workforce, meaning consistent full-time year-round employment compared to non-graduates. And then there is a persistent gender pay gap. Women earn $4,438 less per year than men, even among strongly attached workers. And that finding is consistent with national research. But seeing it in Utah's data, controlling for graduation and STEM status underscores that the gap is not just about field of study.
So thanks for running through those model results with us. But let's be transparent about the boundaries of what this data can and can't tell us. What are some of your key limitations?
Right, so several important limitations to highlight here. We only have data from Utah's public degree granting institutions. So this excludes private institutions like BYU, Westminster, private institutions, and out-of-state institutions. Students who transfer to private or out-of-state institutions look like non-completers in our data, even if they finish a degree somewhere else. It is also important to keep in mind that calculus courses are usually sequential courses, so they can look like repeats even when a student is making progress through calculus 1, 2, and 3. And the wage data itself is limited to Utah UI covered employment. So out of state work, self-employment, federal jobs, and some nonprofit employment were not captured. And it is important to consider variables that were not available to us. For example, self-selection into STEM is not modeled. And that students who choose STEM They may differ in ways that we cannot measure, like family support or prior STEM exposure, that those unmeasured factors may independently influence the students' outcomes.
So thanks for covering those limitations. As we come to an end of this presentation, can you run us through your main takeaways again? What should educators, policymakers, and practitioners do with these findings?
Yeah, so I'd organize the takeaways around the four main findings. On representation, we see that STEM is becoming more diverse. Hispanic enrollment is up, women's participation is rising, and other underrepresented groups are growing, but the gaps remain large, particularly for Black students, Native American students, and Pacific Islander students who are still a very small fraction of STEM enrollees and graduates. Ongoing effort is needed for expanding access.
What about the mathematics finding? What does that mean for practice?
So this one has the most direct implication for intervention. Calculus is a gateway, and that means improving mathematics preparation before and during the first year of higher education is one of the highest leverage things we can do to improve STEM completion rates. Bridge programs, calculus support services, and tutoring, and better alignment between high school math and post-secondary STEM requirements all point to real opportunities. The first year attrition finding amplifies this. 86.8% of pipeline leakage happens in year one, which is also when calculus is typically taken for the first time. So the math support and the first year experience are deeply connected.
Okay, what about the workforce payoff?
So STEM graduates have clear and growing wage advantages over their peers, and also simply declaring STEM major appear to boost workforce attachment and wage outcomes, even for those who don't end up with a STEM or USHI degree.
Great. Thank you, Karen. So thank you for the presentation and the wonderful research. For everyone interested, there is an associated data narrative available at udrc.ushi.edu. If you click on publications, you will see this one, our Education and Workforce Pipeline for STEM Students in Utah, along with additional UDRC research. On that data narrative, you'll find a link to the report itself, where you can get really into the nuances of these results, which we were able to provide a pretty high overview of here. So if anyone has any questions, feel free to use the Q&A function and drop those questions in while we wait for a few questions to come through, because I don't see any. We have another couple questions prepared. So actually, Karen, here's one that we didn't prepare, but it's from Brittany. Do you have a sense of why so many students leave STEM in their first year? Is it academics, finances, belonging, or something else?
Well, that is a great question. Thank you for asking, Brittany. So, it's most likely a combination of things, really. The math course load is a big piece. For example, if you're taking calculus for the first time in higher education and struggling, that can quickly shake your confidence in STEM. Um, but it's also the transition to higher ed, right? STEM programs often require students to jump directly into demanding sequenced coursework in the very first semester with less flexibility to explore than non-STEM programs. Some researchers came up with the term bandwidth to suggest that students from underrepresented groups are also managing cognitive load from financial stress, family obligations, and navigating unfamiliar institutional systems at the same time that they're navigating hard coursework. So the first year concentrates all of that simultaneously.
So we have a question here. I'm curious about the open-ended questions regarding lower graduations in STEM fields by women. Are there recommendations to better understand root causes here? Wondering what you think about whether a policy shift to require a fourth year of math in high school might support STEM prerequisites in preparation for first year calculus.
That is a great question. Thank you for asking. So I would say, so first for this research, I want to point out that we did not use any K-12 data. So we looked at calculus courses, but we also looked at it from like students who took calculus when their student status was still high school as a measure if they took calculus in high school. So AP courses would not count it. But as I touched on earlier, definitely math tutoring and support would be a huge help in first year in higher education. So that transition piece is really large because we see that 86.8% drop in that first year. Um, and also, yes, better alignment between high school mathematics courses and the requirements that students face directly the first semesters that they start at higher education. If they make that transition, if they have a smoother transition there, they may have higher confidence and also continuing to take on more and more challenging classes after that.
Thanks, Karen. So that was actually two questions. That was my fault for misreading that. So the first half was, or the first actual question, was regarding lower graduation rates specifically by women. Do we have any recommendations there?
Um, so that is one of the research that I actually noted for further research. And I think here, because the number of women graduated with STEM degrees are so low, I don't think a data-driven research is a good way to go. It may be better for a qualitative research to really look at the reasons and, yeah, get to the root of it.
Thanks, Karen. I also want to take just a second to address that second one, or the second question about math preparedness. So UDRC is actually currently working on another study about math course taking patterns in high school and then post-secondary results. So there will be another webinar that hopefully kind of addresses those questions for broader than just STEM, but at least hopefully potentially applicable as well. Let's see. So I'm not seeing any other questions in the Q&A. So I'll go ahead and ask one of my other questions. Um, so you mentioned at the beginning of this NAICS code, but then you didn't cover it in any of the main results. For those who aren't familiar, NAICS code studies or describes the industry that someone's employed in. So did that industry of employment matter?
Uh, yes and no. So when we broke the students down by the next code, so meaning next sectors with the highest number of STEM graduates and then next sectors with the highest number of non-STEM graduates, we actually see some overlapping. So for example, among STEM students or STEM graduates rather, the next code where most of them were employed in was professional, scientific, and technical services, and that's next code number 54. 21.4% of the STEM graduates worked in that field. Now, in comparison, 10.3% of the non-STEM graduates worked in that field. And the interesting thing is, if we look at the median wage, first year after they leave education, the STEM graduates were earning $55,047 per year, compared to $37,773 for the non-STEM graduates. So you can see that for those who are the sectors where they're attracting a lot of graduates, we already see the gap existing there. Some other sectors where they share common among the STEM graduates and the non-STEM graduates include educational services and healthcare and social assistance.
Thanks for expanding on that.
Yeah, and all of those will be in the report, which you will be able to access from the data narrative.
Thanks for expanding on that, Karen. Are there any additional questions? I don't see anything in the Q&A or the chat. Okay, I will ask one more, and then if we don't have any, I guess we could end it. So previous UC research on momentum or attention has found slightly higher persistence than this study after the first year. I'm gonna bring up the calculus question one more time. Can we attribute most of that to the math coursework, or do you think there's something else going on there?
So yes, the research that you're referring to, it came from a colleague, Brett Campbell, and from his research, his finding was that for students who began their study in the fall semester, their retention rate started at 74%, I believe, in the second term, then dropped to 53% at the beginning of the second year. Um, so that is still higher than what we found in this study for STEM students specifically. So I would say the difference, yeah, would be just among the major declaration, which came with the calculus piece, or any other scientific or mathematics course load that would happen in the first year doing in the first year for a STEM degree, compared to Brett's research where he was looking at all of the students compared to STEM. So it could mean that that is the piece. It could mean there is something else. Yeah.
Thanks, Karen. So I don't see any additional questions. I want to one more time say the research and the data narrative can be found at udrc.uc.edu. A recording of this webinar will also be available there shortly. So if you know someone who was interested in this and unfortunately wasn't able to make it, please feel free to circulate this webinar and data narrative as well. And I want to thank everyone for taking the time out of their day to join us while we launch our new research. So take care, everyone, and thanks.